For a society to reach a point in civilization where a vast majority of that society does not commit crimes, regardless of whether the law of the land, which I believe should be robust, is enforced or not. That is, regardless of whether they're being policed, they do the right thing. And I'm saying a vast majority of them should do this a vast majority of the time. I'm not saying all of them should do that, because that would be utopian. That would never happen. We're humans, we're not infallible. So for a society to reach that would be when I would call a society civilized. That is, I wouldn't jaywalk regardless of whether someone's watching me or not. And how does one do that is by, again, all of this that I'm saying here should be considered at best my opinion, for what it's worth. So how do we get there is through, number one, a value-based education. Now, values are shared by the society. Now I'm not going to get into a debate on what values a society might share and agree upon, but every society does have a certain set of values that it agrees upon as those that define that society and that the society is proud of having. So once we've got that, which I believe all societies have to varying degrees or levels, once we've got that, those values need to be inculcated and imbibed in the people that make up that society. Now, this needs to be done ideally when they're bringing up their next generations. How do you do that? That is, you do it by acting upon those values. That is, if that generation sees those values being acted upon, being, for example, if they have agreed they wouldn't break the law, and that is what is taught at home, and that is what is taught in the school, but the moment the child steps outside, he or she sees his or her ideal. The ideal could be a father figure, it could be a mother, it could be a teacher. The moment that child sees his or her ideal not living up to those values that he's just been lessoned on, he or she's just been taught, the moment he sees that the father or mother or the teacher or whoever preaches something at home or in the school, but the moment he or she steps out, does something totally different in conflict with what he or she's just preached. Now, that is definitely not the way to imbibe values. To imbibe values, one would have to act upon them to exemplify those values. Again, doing it all the time is calls for someone who is infallible, calls for an ideal situation, calls for utopia. But a civilized society, a vast majority of the people would do it vast majority of the time. So, another very important thing in preventing crimes is to have a sense of empathy. Most normal people who do not have mental issues, and I'm sure psychologists and psychiatrists who are worth their salt might agree with me on this one. A vast majority of normal people are capable of empathizing. Now, empathy is a word that is oftentimes incorrectly confused and interchangeably used, again incorrectly, with sympathy. Sympathizing is to feel bad for another person, but to have empathy is to be able to put one in the shoes of the other person and feel like that person is feeling. The more in detail that you go in mimicking the other person's environment whilst doing so, the better you're at empathy, the better you can empathize. Now, think about it. A cold-blooded killer is able to shoot his or her target without much consideration of what would happen to the life, or not the literal life, but the life that that person had living, his or her family, his or her love life, his or her passions, possibly who he or she depended on and who depends on him or her. For example, if I were able to shoot a person without thinking too much about what's going to happen to those people who depend on him or her, what's going to happen to the life that he'd set up. He may have loans, he may have a house, he may have a daughter who loves him or her, So if I'm able to disassociate myself from those thoughts, not let them come at all, and then go ahead, I'd be able to pull that trigger with relative ease. But if I were to go through the mental exercise of thinking about these things, pulling that trigger is going to be much more challenging a task. Now that is what we need to do to prevent crimes, especially the gory ones. One needs to teach right from the childhood to our next generation the consequences, especially the devastating consequences that one's actions might have on another person's life. Try to explain to them how a child was robbed of his or her father or a mother just because of what he or she did. It's drunken driving or driving at high speeds might give a person a thrill, but if one were to be able to explain to that person the consequences that might have on another person who may be a victim of an accident that results from such negligent driving, that's a very, very, polite term, but again, reckless or negligent action like that might have devastating consequences on another family. That person might be less prone to indulge in that activity. Now, that is the way a society needs to constantly groom its next generations. And if you're able to successfully do that, and this is a continuous process and it needs to be done all the time, if you're able to do this successfully, we can reach that point in civilization where crimes would be the number of crimes that are committed drops. You cannot eradicate it. And again, what I'm suggesting is definitely not an alternative to having the law of the land and having the law of the land enforced almost every time. But again, expecting the law of the land to be enforced in a timely manner, to be enforced such that justice is done all the time, that again is a utopian thought. That again is a thought that if we were to expect it happen, we just go on frustrating ourselves. So we've got the law that should be enforced, but at the same time have a value-based education system, have people who can empathize with their fellow citizens, and I'm sure we'd be living in a better place. So do let me know what your thoughts are.